It's my great pleasure to be here, and it's great to have some international guests as well. Today I'm going to talk about Nordic challenges and solutions, and especially related to, let's say, the pedagogy. But and my presentation is actually based on an inquiry that we sent to all the Nordic countries. But before going on that, let me start with a small narrative. There's a great new comic book, a Finnish comic book, that very nicely plays with cultural stereotypes. The main character of the comic book is called Matti. And Matti is a typical Finn. So he's introvert and he's shy. And this is actually how Matti looks when he is supposed to give a presentation. But Matti doesn't know that he can even get in a worse situation than that. He can get in a situation and find himself in a situation when he realizes that when he needs to give a presentation, he realizes that the previous presenters have, said all those things that he is planned to say. And Matti looks like this. Okay, to be honest, I probably, repeat some of those points that the previous presenters have said. But I hope also that I'm going to add some new points, and especially based on the inquiry that we sent to the Nordic countries. Before going to this inquiry and those analyses that we done with the data, which was done together with Marita, let me somehow try to give you how I understand whether we do have this kind of a, let's say, a Nordic model of early childhood education or a Nordic model of early childhood education pedagogy. Because there seems to be around this kind of a thing. I'm not sure whether it's a myth or is it something that is real. Okay. To my understanding, there's some things that are especially characteristic to or some kind of representatives or topics on early childhood education pedagogy in Nordic countries. And this is based on my colleagues' articles made by Hannigan and Karila. And the basic idea is that the early childhood education pedagogy in Nordic countries has been based on this idea of social pedagogical tradition, which means that we have always, encouraged and enhanced the idea of play, relationships between, children, between adults and children, and curiosity. As we have already heard today, we have built on children's interest, and if you look at the recent, for example, research literature, more and more in children's perspectives. That's how we talk about children's interest nowadays. We've been somehow resisting, as Kirsti said in the morning, this kind of idea of schoolification, that early childhood education should have, value itself. It's not something that, prepares, children for school or for school readiness. It has to be something else as well. And it's this kind of a holistic approach to children's growth, learning, and development in a way. And we try to enhance and be sure that, okay, we are educating and raising and upbringing, well-being children. One thing that characterizes the so-called Nordic model is that we haven't had this kind of what we call this kind of a narrative investment of early childhood education, which means that we think that early childhood education is not only an economic investment, it has to be something else. Because if you look at for some other countries, and for example, what is happening in discourses, put forward by OECD, they mainly consider early child education as an economic investment in a way, to put it briefly. So this has given us this kind of a possibility that we have been able to, to develop our own practices and focus on pedagogy, that we don't have to be accountable of. Nobody's then testing us, or we don't have any external examination or anything like that. I will come a little bit later, I'll come back on this issue of testing and examining, because it seems to be a hot topic nowadays in early child education as well. Because there's going to be a baby pizza, as we heard in the morning. There's been a lot of power on a local level. I mean, in the level of kindergartens, they're run by principals who are very autonomous. Teachers, as we heard in the morning, they are in many cases, they are highly trained, they are qualified, they are autonomous. They are actually the persons who are responsible of assessing children's learning, growth and development, and also in many cases, responsible of developing local curriculums. So this is, I would say that we have, this kind of a trust in a profession that is an autonomous profession, an expert profession that is kind of a commitment to their work and knows, what needs to be done. And in this sense, I always say, if you want to make a summary of all this, that we've been running, running this kind of a counter stream of what happens in the rest of the world. Because of this, no testing, no exams, autonomous teachers, power on the local level. This is something that is, I think, somehow characterizes the so-called Nordic approach or Nordic model to early child education. But at the same time, we have to remember that, okay, there's a great variation between Nordic countries as well, because of their history, their political systems, for example, how many persons, what kind of staff they have working in early child education, and especially if you think about the things that has happened lately in the whole Europe and Nordic countries. I mean, this huge challenge of asylum seekers and refugees, which is going to be a challenge for us in early education as well, and something to think about in the future. So, what we did, and which is the main topic of my presentation today, is that we sent an inquiry to every Nordic country. I wanted to find out what are the current challenges and practices in Nordic countries related to early child education. And now I have to remind you that what we did is not any way a rigorous, robust scientific research. It's more like a very descriptive, try to understand what happens at this moment in Nordic countries. So it was sent to Denmark, Finland, Greenland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and Holland. And the inquiry was mainly developed by the Ministry of Education and Culture here in Finland, and they actually also sent the inquiry to put that forward. And yeah, we asked, to be honest, we asked several questions. We actually asked too many questions. There are some people, nodding in the audience. They may be those one who actually responded to the questionnaire or so on. So we have three main questions. So challenges and needs in the current situation of early education and care. What kind of good practices and methods have been introduced or invented to be able to respond to these challenges? And then, how does it look like? How the future does look like? Which are the key areas for development in the future? These were the three main questions. And these were then divided in two dimensions. One as a general, and then all these three questions concerning especially refugees and asylum seekers. But this is not enough. Then we ask also all these questions in 4 additional dimensions. daily activity, administration, daily activities, research, and highlighted by the research. So here's an example of how one question looks like. And this is the first question from the perspective of administration. And we had, 23 more questions like this. Those respondents, they were actually from ministries of education, and that's all we know, because they wanted to keep their anonymity, so we don't know, very much about them. They are, people working in Ministry of Education, maybe administrative people or something like that. And what we actually received, we received 33 pages of written text, which is a quite huge pile of papers. Not all countries responded to all questions, and there was a lot of variation in responses. For example, in some cases, when people were talking about good practices, it was quite hard to figure out whether they were talking about practices that are actually put into practice already, or whether they are somehow wishes of some practices that should be put in practice in the future, or should be invented, or should be worked on. So this was one main difficulty for us when we tried to do the coding, and when we tried especially do some interpretation based on the data. So what we then did was that we actually coded the data in two phases first. According to every question, they were actually coded separately. And the second phase, then we started looking at this kind of patterns across the questions. What are the common topics, despite the questions, what people are actually talking about? Is there something that we can find that is common for Nordic countries? So we made this kind of let's say a selection, which is perhaps based on our values somehow, that we decided to select this kind of things. Okay, common topics for all countries. This is actually a picture from the first stage of our coding. This is what kind of things we actually pick up on the first stage of our coding. And you can see actually that there's a great variety. And on the right side, these are responses concerning refugees and asylum seekers. And this is what we call general. So there's a great variety of things. And you can pretty easily see that they are actually things that are topics that are different levels. Some are policy level issues, some are very practical issues, some relate somehow to research or research topics or this kind of things. So, to be honest, a bit messy data, but that's how data quite often is. So this was kind of demonstration of the first stage of the coding. And then, after the second coding, we actually ended up with this kind of, let's say, categories. 5 categories in let's say, in each group, in general, in asylum seekers and immigrants. And now, actually, I would like to pose a question for you, audience, because I know that there's a lot of, experts. The room is actually full of experts in early child education. So, how would you, based on your knowledge about Nordic countries and Nordic early child education, how would you interpret these categories? What do they tell you? They tell me some things, but I would like to know how do you find them out? How would you interpret them? What do they tell to you? would you like to be a chair for a couple of minutes?
Yes, I can
please.
be a chair. Sorry,
And these are not based on any real true scientific analysis, just you know.
Please.
Sorry, again, looking at these challenges from the outside the Nordic countries, I would say a very similar list of challenges would come up from almost every country in Europe.
I know, that's my impression too.
Yes.
Yeah. So we are dealing with the global things. And for example, if you look at this idea that there should be collaboration, more collaboration, I would say across and crossing some, professional boundaries. That's kind of a self-evident if you look at the world, around us, which is, very turbulent, changing quickly. So there needs to be, this kind of, let's say, crossing boundaries of expertise and trying to understand, what is happening in the field of early education. That's pretty understandable. And even as Kirsti said in the morning that, Nordic countries are well known that they have, in many cases, high quality staff. There's still a great need for professional development. And this actually came out in many dimensions and in the case of every country. And it's quite interesting in a way. And curriculum. And if you look at the column of immigrants and asylum seekers, it's very understandable. Okay, there's a huge need for more resources on working with immigrant families and immigrant children and asylum seekers. How should we somehow organize early child education services for, let's say, for asylum seekers and their children? So what is the case in different countries? So I think this is a big question, and many actual respondents pick this kind of thing up. So what should we do with this kind of thing? And of course, perhaps we need teachers who are interculturally competent and so on. But as you said, I wasn't surprised neither about those things that the people actually talk about. Then about those good practices that the Nordic countries had invented or put into practice to solve all these challenges or problems they had. The variety was, much bigger than, on those other things. And once again, they are on very different levels. There are good practices on the policy level. There are practices on daily pedagogical level, and so on and so on. I won't go them in the detail. After my presentation, I promised to give a Marita if she wants to say something about what we have done and find out. Okay. I just then want to pick up one thing. I already said that there seems to be a huge need for high-quality teachers, high-quality staff, and more professional development, and also on issues such as leadership. And then I actually did some I calculated some frequencies, and one of the concepts or terms that came up most frequently was equality, which is perhaps no surprise. But then I started to think about that. It's this talk about quality and why people were actually referring to quality. Because they were referring to quality when they were talking about daily practices, pedagogy, administration, even setting up this kind of a quality assurance systems in some countries. So what does this, tell us, this quality talk? Where does it come from? Where does it refer to? And of course, there are different ways to interpret this, let's say, growing quality talk. And now I'm going to do one interpretation, which is based on this data. And I think that one way that we can understand is that it actually reflects what some researchers call germ. And germ refers to the idea that perhaps the whole landscape of early childhood education is changing. GERM refers to, it's an acronym and refers to Global Educational Reform Movement. And characteristic of GERM is standardization, focus on core subjects like, literacy, maths. It doesn't support taking risks in pedagogical innovations. Because if you are, let's say, training kids for tests, you won't take risk and you don't, make innovative openings in pedagogy, for example. It's about using corporate management models in kindergartens or daycare. And then it ends up with this kind of taste-based accountability policies. And now, don't get me wrong, I don't have anything against quality or that we should somehow be able to evaluate the quality of early childhood education services. But I'm just worried about that who is going to do it, with what kind of tools, what reasons, and what kind of consequences it is going to have. And this is what I wanted to pick up this idea of a germ, because it is spreading around the global world at this moment. And it's very visible in schools, and you all of us know that what goes to school comes to early childhood education as well. And of course, we have just heard that, okay, there's going to be a baby PISA. OECD is going to start to test 5-year-olds. To my understanding, they are going to do their first pilots on 2017, and then a larger scale, assessment or testing on 2018. And by the way, there's a great article just published by Peter Moss and his colleagues when they tried to evaluate and understand what is this, this baby PISA about. I suggest that you all read the paper. Okay. So, my last slide and last points are that do we have a Nordic approach of model early childhood education? And do we need a one? And if we need one, what for? Is it against the germ? Does it save us from the germ? Or what it stands for? Why does it exist? Should we develop it, or should we just, give up and join to the global world? Thank you.